Chapter 1. A Silent Night. The December wind whistled through the empty streets of Burlington, Vermont, carrying snowflakes that danced in the dim light of the street lamps. Alexander Morrison stood at his office window on the top floor of the Morrison Industries building, watching the city prepare for Christmas Eve. At 52, he had achieved everything society deemed successful: a thriving business empire, a magnificent mansion, and more wealth than he could spend in several lifetimes. Yet, as he observed the festive decorations and cheerful shoppers below, he felt nothing but a hollow ache in his chest. 5 years had passed since that fateful morning when his world shattered. His wife Catherine and their son Tommy had been his everything. The reason he smiled, the force that made his luxury mansion feel like a home. Now that same mansion stood as a mausoleum of memories, each room echoing with the ghosts of laughter that once filled its halls. Alexander adjusted his expensive wool coat and decided to walk home instead of calling his driver. The corporate Christmas party had ended hours ago, but he had lingered, dreading another silent evening in his empty house. The streets were quieter now, with most families already gathered around their dinner tables or Christmas trees. His footsteps crunched in the fresh snow as he made his way toward the city center. Burlington's Church Street marketplace, usually bustling with tourists and locals, was transforming into a peaceful winter wonderland. The historic buildings wore strings of white lights like delicate jewelry, and the air carried the mingled scents of pine and cinnamon from nearby shops. Alexander found himself drawn to the central plaza, where a magnificent Christmas tree stood proud and tall, its lights twinkling against the darkening sky. As he approached the tree, something caught his attention, a sound so faint he almost missed it over the whisper of the wind. It was a hushed conversation, punctuated by what sounded like a child's sniffle. Alexander followed the sound to a partially hidden bench behind the tree. There, huddled together under a thin blanket, sat 2 children. The sight stopped him in his tracks. The older child, a girl with intelligent eyes and long dark hair, couldn't have been more than 8. She held a younger boy close to her side, probably around 5, who buried his face in her shoulder. They were dressed inadequately for the winter weather, their clothes worn but clean, suggesting recent hardship rather than long-term neglect. "Are you both all right?" Alexander asked softly, careful not to startle them. The girl's eyes met his, filled with a mixture of wariness and resignation that no child should possess. "We're fine, sir," she replied with remarkable composure for someone so young, just waiting for someone. Her small hand clutched something around her neck, a pendant of some sort, while her other arm remained protectively wrapped around the boy. Alexander glanced around the empty plaza. No adult seemed to be watching these children, and the temperature was dropping rapidly as night approached. "How long have you been waiting?" he asked, already shrugging off his coat. The girl hesitated, her facade of confidence wavering slightly. "A while," she admitted. The boy shifted, revealing his face, and Alexander's heart clenched at the sight of his red-rimmed eyes and quivering lip. "I'm cold, Sarah," the boy whispered to his sister. Though his voice carried in the quiet plaza, without hesitation, Alexander draped his coat over both children. "My name is Alexander Morrison," he said, crouching down to their level. "There's a diner just around the corner that stays open on Christmas Eve. Would you like to get something warm to eat while we figure this out?" Sarah's eyes widened at his name, something flickering across her face too quickly for Alexander to interpret. She looked down at her brother, then back at Alexander, weighing her options with a maturity that seemed beyond her years. Finally, she nodded. "I'm Sarah," she said, standing and helping her brother up. "This is Daniel, but everyone calls him Danny." As they walked toward the diner, Alexander noticed how Sarah kept one hand on her brother and the other on the pendant around her neck. The boy, Danny, stumbled slightly in his 2 big shoes, and Alexander instinctively reached out to steady him. The child's small hand felt like ice in his warm grip. The bells above the diner door chimed as they entered, drawing the attention of the few patrons seeking refuge from the cold. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, took one look at the children and immediately directed them to a booth near the heating vent. As she hurried off to fetch hot chocolate, Alexander watched the siblings settle into the warmth of the diner, their shoulders gradually relaxing. Looking at them in the bright light of the diner, Alexander noticed details he had missed in the plaza. Though their clothes were worn, they were carefully mended. Sarah's hair was neatly braided and Danny's was recently trimmed. These children had been cared for by someone, and not long ago. The mystery of their situation stirred something in Alexander, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. As steam rose from the hot chocolates the waitress set before them, Alexander made a decision that would change not only his life but the lives of these two children forever. He just didn't know it yet. Chapter 2. Whispers of Hope. The diner's warm lights cast a gentle glow over the booth where Alexander sat with Sarah and Danny, watching as they devoured their grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. The waitress, Martha according to her name, Tag, kept finding excuses to pass by their table, refilling drinks and offering extra napkins with a knowing smile. "When was the last time you ate?" Alexander asked gently, noting how Sarah made sure Danny ate first, only taking bites of her own food after ensuring her brother was satisfied. "This morning," Sarah answered, her eyes fixed on her soup. "We had some bread and apples from—" She trailed off, that same guarded look returning to her face. Alexander didn't press for details. Instead, he observed how Sarah's free hand kept returning to the pendant around her neck, a nervous habit that seemed to comfort her. The necklace itself was simple, a small silver locket that had seen better days, but was clearly cherished. "That's a beautiful necklace," he commented casually. Sarah's hand immediately wrapped around it protectively, but her expression softened slightly. "It was our mother's," she said quietly, glancing at Danny, who was focused on dunking his grilled cheese into his soup. "She gave it to me before—" Again she stopped herself, but this time her eyes welled with tears she refused to let fall. Outside, the snow was falling harder now, coating Burlington in a thick white blanket that muffled the world. The diner's windows had frosted over, creating the illusion that they were in their own private snow globe, separated from the harsh realities beyond the glass. "My house isn't far from here," Alexander found himself saying, surprising even himself with the words. "It's too cold for you to be out tonight, especially on Christmas Eve. I have plenty of room, and you'd be safe there while we sort things." "Out?" Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly, years of learned caution warring with desperate need. "We don't know you," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "That's very wise of you," Alexander nodded approvingly. "How about this? Martha here knows me well. I've been coming to this diner for years. Would it help if she vouched for me?" The waitress, who had been hovering nearby, stepped forward with a warm smile. "Mr. Morrison is good people, honey. He funded the children's wing at the hospital and helps organize the town's Christmas charity drive every year. You couldn't be in safer hands." Sarah's grip on her pendant loosened slightly. Danny, who had been quietly listening while finishing his soup, looked up at his sister with hopeful eyes. "Can we, Sarah? I'm so tired." Alexander watched as Sarah's resistance crumbled in the face of her brother's plea. She straightened her shoulders, making one last attempt at being the responsible adult she'd been forced to become. "You promise we'll be safe?" "I give you my word," Alexander replied solemnly, "and tomorrow we can work on finding out where you belong." Something flickered in Sarah's eyes at those words, fear perhaps, or something else. But she nodded, slowly. "Okay," she whispered, "but we stay together." "Of course," Alexander agreed immediately. "Always together." The walk to Morrison Manor was short but magical. The snow had transformed the streets into something out of a fairy tale, and Danny's excitement proved contagious. He pointed at Christmas decorations with growing enthusiasm, his earlier exhaustion temporarily forgotten in the wonder of the moment. As they approached the gates of the manor, both children fell silent. The house stood like a castle against the snowy sky, its Victorian architecture enhanced by tasteful Christmas lights that outlined its elegant features. Alexander saw his home through fresh eyes as they walked up the circular driveway, imposing, beautiful, but also lonely. "You live here?" Danny whispered, awe evident in his voice. "It's like a palace." "It's just a house," Alexander replied, thinking of how empty it had felt for the past 5 years. but maybe you two can help make it feel more like a home again." Mrs. Sullivan, his housekeeper, was waiting at the door, alerted by the security system of their approach. Her eyes widened at the sight of the children, but years of professional discretion kept her expression neutral. "I've prepared the blue guest rooms, Mr. Morrison," she said smoothly, as if she'd been expecting them all along, and took the liberty of starting some hot apple cider. As they stepped into the warmth of the foyer, Alexander watched Sarah and Danny take in their surroundings. The grand staircase, the crystal chandelier, the tasteful Christmas decorations, it all seemed excessive now, through the eyes of these two children who had been huddled on a park bench just hours ago. "Mrs. Sullivan, these are our guests, Sarah and Danny," Alexander introduced them. "They'll be staying with us for a while." He turned to the children. "Mrs. Sullivan makes the best apple cider in Vermont. Would you like some before bed?" Danny nodded enthusiastically, but Sarah's attention was fixed on something else. She had wandered to the base of the staircase where family photos lined the wall. Her hand went to her pendant again as she studied a particular photograph, one of Alexander with his sister Elizabeth at their parents' anniversary party, taken over a decade ago. The intensity of Sarah's gaze sent a strange shiver down Alexander's spine, but before he could question it, Danny's tired yawn drew everyone's attention. The evening's events were finally catching up with the young boy. "Perhaps the cider can wait until morning," Mrs. Sullivan suggested gently. "Let me show you to your rooms." As they climbed the stairs, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that this Christmas Eve had set something profound in motion. The silence of his home had been broken by the sound of children's footsteps, and somehow it felt right. What he didn't know was that the photograph that had caught Sarah's attention would soon unlock a mystery that had been waiting years to be solved. Chapter 3. Morning Light. Christmas morning dawned with a pristine blanket of snow covering Burlington. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Morrison Manor, casting warm rectangles of light across the polished hardwood floors. Alexander had barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of the two children sleeping upstairs in the blue guest rooms. He found himself in his study earlier than usual, nursing a cup of coffee and watching the sunrise paint the snow-covered grounds in shades of pink and gold. The morning silence was broken by the soft pad of small feet in the hallway. He turned to find Sarah standing in the doorway, still in the oversized pajamas Mrs. Sullivan had found for her, her precious pendant still hanging around her neck. "Good morning," Alexander smiled, gesturing for her to come in. "Did you sleep?" "Well," Sarah nodded, though the shadows under her eyes suggested otherwise. She approached his desk cautiously, her eyes scanning the room with that same intelligent curiosity he'd noticed the night before. The study walls were lined with books and family photographs, and once again, Sarah's attention was drawn to them. "Is this your family?" she asked, pointing to a particular photo, the same one she'd noticed in the stairwell the night before. It showed a younger Alexander with his arm around his sister Elizabeth, both of them laughing at some forgotten joke. "Yes," Alexander replied, moving to stand beside her. "That's me and my sister Elizabeth, taken about 12 years ago." He paused, feeling the familiar ache whenever he thought of his sister. "I haven't seen her in a long time." Sarah's hand went to her pendant, a gesture Alexander was beginning to recognize as a sign of nervous energy. "What happened to her?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before Alexander could answer, Danny appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Unlike his sister, he seemed to have slept soundly, his face peaceful and relaxed. "Sarah?" he called out, still groggy. "I woke up and you weren't there." Sarah immediately moved to her brother's side, her questions about Elizabeth forgotten. Alexander watched their interaction with growing fascination, the way Sarah constantly positioned herself between Danny and the world, the careful way she monitored his moods and needs. It spoke of long practice and deep devotion. "Are you hungry?" Alexander asked, directing the question to both children but watching Danny's face light up at the mention of food. "Mrs. Sullivan always prepares a special Christmas breakfast." The kitchen was warm and fragrant with the smell of cinnamon and coffee when they arrived. Mrs. Sullivan had outdone herself, preparing a feast of French toast, scrambled eggs, bacon and fresh fruit. Danny's eyes grew wide at the sight, while Sarah helped him into a chair with practiced care. As they ate, Alexander observed the siblings more closely. Despite their obvious hunger, both children displayed impeccable manners. Sarah cut Danny's French toast into neat squares before serving herself, and both used their napkins without prompting. These were not children who had grown up on the streets. They had been raised with attention and care. "Would you like to see the rest of the house after breakfast?" Alexander offered, watching Danny's face light up while Sarah remained cautiously neutral. "There's a library full of children's books and a game room that hasn't been used in years." "Can we, Sarah?" Danny pleaded, turning to his sister with hopeful eyes. Sarah hesitated, her hand automatically going to her pendant. "I suppose," she started, but was interrupted by Mrs. Sullivan entering the kitchen with an armful of wrapped presents. "I hope you don't mind, Mr. Morrison," the housekeeper said, setting the packages on a nearby counter, "but I took the liberty of wrapping a few things for our young guests last night. It is Christmas, after all." Alexander smiled, grateful for his housekeeper's thoughtfulness. "Of course, thank you, Mrs. Sullivan." Danny's eyes grew even wider at the sight of the presents, but he didn't move from his chair, looking to Sarah for permission. She, in turn, looked to Alexander, her expression a mixture of gratitude and wariness. "They're for both of you," Alexander assured them. "It's not much, just some warm clothes and a few other necessities Mrs. Sullivan picked up from the storeroom of my children's charity foundation." As the children opened their gifts, warm sweaters, boots, gloves, and a few carefully chosen toys, Alexander noticed something remarkable. The morning light streaming through the kitchen windows seemed brighter somehow, the room warmer and more alive than it had been in years. The sound of Danny's delighted gasps and even Sarah's careful thank yous filled a void he hadn't fully acknowledged until now. While helping Danny try on his new winter boots, Sarah's pendant caught the sunlight, drawing Alexander's attention once again. For just a moment, he glimpsed what appeared to be an engraving on its surface, but Sarah quickly tucked it back under her sweater when she noticed his gaze. The morning progressed with a tour of the house, Danny's enthusiasm gradually wearing down Sarah's reservations. As they explored each room, Alexander found himself sharing stories about the house and its history, surprised by how easily they flowed after years of silence. But it was in the library that everything began to shift. Chapter 4. Echoes of the... Past the library was Alexander's favorite room in the house, its walls lined floor to ceiling with books collected over generations. Afternoon light streamed through tall windows, illuminating dancing dust motes and giving the space an almost magical quality. Danny immediately gravitated toward the children's section, while Sarah's attention was caught by the family portraits adorning the walls. "Who's that?" she asked, pointing to a formal portrait of an elegant woman with familiar dark hair and bright eyes. "That's Elizabeth again, my sister," Alexander replied, moving closer to the portrait. "This was painted just before she..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Before she went away." Sarah's hand went to her pendant again, but this time, instead of clutching it protectively, she seemed to be considering something. After a moment of internal debate, she spoke softly. "Our mother had a picture like this. She used to look at it a lot, especially when she was sad." It was the first time either child had voluntarily mentioned their mother. Alexander kept his voice gentle, careful not to frighten away this moment of openness. "Your mother sounds like someone who appreciated beautiful things." "She was," Sarah nodded, then caught herself. "She is. She just needed to go away for a while." Her voice wavered slightly on the last words. Before Alexander could respond, Danny called out from across the room, "Sarah, look, they have the Velveteen Rabbit. Mum used to read this to us all the time." The excitement in Danny's voice faded to uncertainty as he realized what he'd said. Sarah quickly moved to his side, putting an arm around his shoulders. The moment felt fragile, like a soap bubble about to burst. Alexander made a decision. Moving to a nearby armchair, he sat down and gestured to the children. "Would you like me to read it? It was my son Tommy's favorite book too." It was the first time he'd mentioned Tommy to them, and something in his voice must have conveyed the weight of that revelation. Both children looked at him with new understanding in their eyes. Danny was the first to move, climbing into the chair next to Alexander with the book. After a moment's hesitation, Sarah perched on the arm of the chair. As Alexander began to read, his voice grew stronger with each page. The familiar words brought back memories, but for the first time in years, they didn't feel like daggers to his heart. Danny leaned against him, completely absorbed in the story, while Sarah gradually relaxed her vigilant posture. When Mrs. Sullivan found them an hour later, they had moved on to their second book. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the scene with misty eyes before quietly announcing that lunch was ready. Over sandwiches and hot soup, Alexander noticed Sarah stealing glances at him, as if trying to solve a puzzle. Finally, she spoke up. "What happened to your son?" The question hung in the air. Mrs. Sullivan, who had been tidying nearby, froze in place, but Alexander found that he wanted to answer. "There was an accident 5 years ago. Tommy and my wife, Catherine, were driving home from his piano lesson when another car lost control on the ice." Sarah's face softened with understanding. "That's why you were alone last night on Christmas Eve." Alexander nodded, surprised by how much easier it felt to talk about it with these children who seemed to understand loss in their own way. "Yes, the house felt too quiet after that. But sometimes," he glanced at Danny, who was carefully arranging his crusts into a pattern on his plate, "life has a way of bringing unexpected gifts." After lunch, while Danny napped on a window seat in the library, Sarah approached Alexander with determination in her eyes. She reached for her pendant, and for the first time deliberately held it out for him to see. "It was our mother's," she said softly. "She gave it to me the day she had to leave. She said it would keep us safe until she could come back." Alexander leaned closer to examine the locket. It was silver, tarnished with age but clearly well-loved. On its surface was an engraving that made his heart stop, an intricate design he recognized immediately. It was the Morrison family crest, the same one that adorned the letterhead of his company and the gates of the manor. "Sarah," he said carefully, his mind racing with implications, "do you know your mother's full name?" The girl nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. "Elizabeth," she whispered. "Elizabeth Morrison." The revelation hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and questions. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting past the library windows. In his sleep, Danny shifted slightly, making a small sound that reminded Alexander of Tommy at that age. Everything was changing, like the snow transforming the landscape outside. But for the first time in years, change didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like the beginning of something extraordinary. Chapter 5. Pieces of Truth. The days following Christmas passed in a blur of activity at Morrison Manor. Alexander had immediately contacted James Wheeler, his most trusted private investigator, scheduling an urgent meeting for the day after the holiday. Now sitting in his study with Wheeler, Alexander found himself struggling to maintain his usual composed demeanor. "Let me understand this clearly," Wheeler said, reviewing his notes. "Your sister Elizabeth, who disappeared 8 years ago, has 2 children you never knew about, and they somehow found their way to you on Christmas Eve." "I know how it sounds," Alexander replied, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair. "But the pendant Sarah carries, it's definitely a Morrison family heirloom. I remember when our mother gave it to Elizabeth on her 16th birthday. Through the study window, they could see Sarah and Danny playing in the snow with Mrs. Sullivan, building what appeared to be an entire family of snowmen. The children had begun to relax over the past few days, though Sarah still maintained her protective watch over her brother. "Tell me everything you remember about Elizabeth's disappearance," Wheeler prompted, his pen poised over his notebook. Alexander leaned back in his chair, memories flooding back. "She started acting differently about 9 years ago, more secretive, withdrawn. When I tried to talk to her about it, she would change the subject. Then one day she was just gone. Left a note saying she needed time to figure things out. I hired investigators, of course, but they never found anything concrete." "And you never knew she was pregnant?" "Never," Alexander shook his head. "Looking at the children's ages now, she must have been expecting Sarah when she first started pulling away." But why wouldn't she tell me? We were always close, especially after our parents passed. Wheeler made another note. The children must have some memories of their early years. Have they shared anything useful? They're careful about what they say, Alexander replied. Sarah especially. But they've let slip a few details, references to moving frequently, mentions of their mother being sick. Danny talked about a garden with purple flowers where they used to live, and Sarah once mentioned a doctor who visited their mother regularly. Outside, Danny's laughter floated through the window as Mrs. Sullivan helped him add a carrot nose to one of the snowmen. Sarah watched them from a few feet away, and even from this distance, Alexander could see her hand go to her pendant, a gesture he now recognized as both protective and reassuring. I'll need to speak with them, Wheeler said gently. Especially Sarah. She seems to remember more, and that pendant might hold additional clues. Alexander nodded, though the thought of questioning the children made him uncomfortable. Be gentle. With them, James. They've been through enough already. Of course. Wheeler packed away his notebook. I'll start with hospital records from 8 to 9 years ago. If Elizabeth was pregnant, she must have received prenatal care somewhere. The doctor visits Danny mentioned might lead us somewhere too. As Wheeler stood to leave, Alexander walked him to the study door. There's something else, he said quietly. Sarah mentioned their mother being sad a lot, looking at old family photos. And the way they talk about her, it's as if she's still alive but unreachable somehow. Wheeler's expression turned thoughtful. Have you considered psychiatric facilities? If Elizabeth was struggling with her mental health? The suggestion hit Alexander like a physical blow. How had he not considered this possibility? His mind raced back to Elizabeth's final months before her disappearance, the mood swings, the paranoia, the increasingly erratic behavior he'd attributed to stress. I'll look into it, Wheeler assured him, noting Alexander's reaction. Discreetly, of course. The last thing we want is media attention on this situation. After Wheeler left, Alexander stood watching the children through the window. Sarah had finally joined in the snowman building, showing Danny how to pack the snow just right to make it stick. The sight of them playing in the winter sunlight, their cheeks rosy with cold and excitement, made his chest tight with emotion. Mrs. Sullivan appeared at his elbow with a cup of coffee. They're good children, Mr. Morrison, she said softly. Despite everything they've been through, they still know how to find joy, rather like their mother that way. Alexander turned to his housekeeper in surprise. You remember Elizabeth well? Of course, sir. She used to spend hours in the kitchen with me, especially during the holidays, always asking questions, wanting to learn everything. Mrs. Sullivan smiled at the memory. Miss Sarah has that same curiosity about her, and young Danny has your sister's laugh, though I doubt he knows it. Looking back out at the snow-covered grounds, Alexander watched as Sarah helped Danny put the finishing touches on their snowman family. The children had positioned them in a circle, holding stick hands, with one larger snowman standing protectively over two smaller ones. The symbolism wasn't lost on Alexander. Somewhere out there, Elizabeth was waiting to be found, and her children had somehow led him to the first real clue in 8 years. As he watched Sarah adjust her brother's scarf with familiar maternal care, Alexander made a silent promise to his sister. He would find her, and he would make sure her children never had to face the world alone again. But first, he needed to earn their trust completely. The pieces of truth they held were fragile, like the snowflakes still falling outside, beautiful but easily destroyed by too much pressure or heat. He would have to be patient, letting them share their story at their own pace, while Wheeler worked to uncover the rest. Chapter 6. Shadows and Light. The new year arrived with a fresh blanket of snow and promising developments in Wheeler's investigation. Alexander sat in his home office, reviewing the preliminary findings while trying to process their implications. Several psychiatric facilities in the Northeast had records of a patient matching Elizabeth's description, admitted under various names but always with similar details. A woman in her 30s with 2 young children, struggling with memory issues and paranoid episodes. The latest lead pointed to a small private facility in upstate New York called Riverside Haven. Wheeler had discovered admission records for a Beth Morris, who arrived there 3 months ago, accompanied by 2 children who were subsequently placed in temporary care. The timing aligned perfectly with when Sarah and Danny must have begun their journey that led them to Burlington. A knock at his office door interrupted his thoughts. Sarah stood in the doorway, her expression serious, beyond her years. "Uncle Alexander," she said, testing out the title they'd begun using a few days ago. "Can I talk to you about something?" "Of course," he replied, quickly tucking Wheeler's reports into a drawer. "Come in." Sarah approached his desk, her hand clutching her pendant. As always, but this time instead of holding it protectively, she unclasped it from her neck and held it out to him. I think it's time you saw what's inside." Alexander accepted the locket with careful hands, aware of the trust this gesture represented. The silver was warm from being worn against her skin, the Morrison family crest clearly visible despite years of wear. With gentle fingers, he found the tiny latch and opened it. Inside were 2 photos, carefully preserved. One showed Elizabeth, holding a newborn Sarah, her face tired but radiant with joy. The other was more recent, Elizabeth with both children standing in front of a garden filled with blooming jacaranda trees, their purple flowers creating a magical backdrop. But it was the small folded paper tucked behind the photos that made Alexander's breath catch. Written in Elizabeth's distinctive handwriting was a message: "My dearest children, if you're reading this, remember that love finds its way home. Trust the Morrison heart to guide you. All my love, Mama." Sarah watched his face carefully as he read the note. "Mum said if anything ever happened to her, we should find the Morrison family. She said they would protect us. But she also said we had to be careful about who we trusted, because sometimes people aren't what they seem. Is that why you were so cautious when we first met?" Alexander asked softly. Sarah nodded. "When we saw your name in the newspaper article about the children's hospital wing, Danny and I knew we had to find you, but Mom always said to watch and wait, to be sure before revealing ourselves." "You're very wise for your age, Sarah," Alexander said, carefully returning the pendant to her. "Your mother taught you well." "She did," Sarah agreed, her voice wavering slightly. "But sometimes she would get confused. She'd forget what day it was, or she'd think people were following us. That's when we started moving a lot." Alexander leaned forward, keeping his voice gentle. "Sarah, do you remember the last place you lived with your mother? The place with the purple flowers?" "Riverside," Sarah whispered, looking down at her hands. "Mom said it was a special hospital where doctors would help her remember things better. But then one day, the doctors said we couldn't stay with her anymore. They sent us to a temporary home, but Danny was so upset and I remembered what Mom said about finding the Morrisons." "So you ran away to find me," Alexander finished, understanding dawning in his heart. Sarah nodded, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "I had to protect Danny, and I had to find help for Mom. The doctors at Riverside were nice, but they said they were running out of funding, that they might have to close soon. Mom was finally starting to get better there. She was remembering more things." Alexander rose from his desk and knelt beside Sarah's chair, offering her his handkerchief. "You've been so brave carrying all this responsibility on your young shoulders, but you don't have to do it alone anymore. You'll help us find her?" Sarah asked, hope and fear mingling in her voice. "We already have," Alexander replied, deciding to trust her with the truth. "Mr. Wheeler found Riverside Haven, and your mother is still there. We're going to visit her tomorrow if you and Danny feel ready." Sarah's eyes widened. "Really? She's really there?" "Really," Alexander confirmed. "And Sarah? The hospital's financial troubles. That's something I can help with. No one is going to separate your family again." For the first time since Christmas Eve, Sarah's careful composure crumbled completely. She threw her arms around Alexander's neck, sobbing into his shoulder. He held her close, his own eyes misting over as he felt the weight of her relief. Outside his office, Danny's voice could be heard chatting happily with Mrs. Sullivan about the possibilities of planting their own jacaranda tree in the spring. The sound of their conversation, mixed with Sarah's quieting sniffles, created a symphony of hope, a promise of healing for all of them. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now Alexander simply held his niece, marveling at how love could bridge even the widest gaps of time and circumstance. The Morrison family was finding its way back together, one piece at a time. Chapter 7. The Heart Remembers. The drive to Riverside Haven took just over 3 hours, though to Alexander it felt much longer. Sarah sat beside him in the back of the car, alternating between watching the snowy landscape and checking on Danny, who had fallen asleep with his head on her lap. Their driver, Thomas, navigated the winding roads with practiced ease, while Wheeler followed in a separate car, close enough to provide support if needed, but maintaining enough distance to give the family privacy. Riverside Haven lived up to its name. The facility sat on a beautiful piece of property overlooking the Hudson River, its Victorian architecture somehow both imposing and welcoming. Gardens, now dormant under winter snow, surrounded the main building, and Alexander could imagine how beautiful they must be in spring, when the jacaranda trees bloomed. As they pulled up to the entrance, Sarah gently woke Danny. "We're here," she whispered, smoothing his tousled hair. "Remember what we talked about? Mom might be a little different, but it's still her." Alexander's heart ached at the maturity in Sarah's voice. No 8-year-old should have to prepare their younger sibling for such a moment, yet here she was, showing more strength than many adults he knew. The facility's director, Dr. Emily Chen, met them in her office. She was younger than Alexander expected, with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor that immediately put the children at ease. "Elizabeth has been making remarkable progress," Dr. Chen explained, reviewing her notes. "The consistent routine and therapeutic environment have helped stabilize her condition. She still has moments of confusion, but they're becoming less frequent. The biggest challenge has been her anxiety over her children's whereabouts." "Does she know we're coming?" Alexander asked, aware of Danny pressing closer to his side. Dr. Chen nodded. "We told her this morning that her family was coming to visit. She's been asking for her locket, the one Sarah's wearing. It seems to be an important anchor for her memories." Sarah's hand automatically went to the pendant. "Can I give it back to her?" "That might be very helpful," Dr. Chen smiled. "Are you all ready to see her?" "She's in the garden room. It's her favorite place in the facility." The garden room was a beautiful sunlit space, filled with potted plants and comfortable furniture. Large windows overlooked the snow-covered grounds and the river beyond. And there, sitting in a chair by the window, was Elizabeth. Alexander almost stumbled at the sight of his sister. She looked both older and younger than he remembered, her dark hair now streaked with silver, her face lined with experience, but her eyes holding the same bright intelligence he remembered from their childhood. Elizabeth turned at the sound of their entrance, and for a moment everyone held their breath. Her eyes moved from face to face, confusion and recognition warring in her expression. "Sarah," she whispered, rising slowly from her chair. "Danny? My babies?" Sarah moved first, walking forward with measured steps, holding out the locket. "We kept it safe, Mom, just like you told us to." Elizabeth's hands shook as she touched the pendant, then her daughter's face. "My brave girl. My clever, brave girl?" Her eyes filled with tears as Danny ran forward to join his sister. "And my sweet Danny, you've grown so much." Alexander hung back, watching as Elizabeth gathered her children close, whispering words of love and apology. When she finally looked up and saw him, her eyes widened with recognition and remembered love. "Alex," she breathed, one arm still around each child, "you found them. You kept them safe." "They found me, actually," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "On Christmas Eve, of all nights." Elizabeth laughed softly, though tears still streamed down her face. "Of course they did. The Morrison heart always finds its way home." She held out one hand to her brother. "Can you forgive me, Alex, for keeping them a secret, for running away?" Alexander crossed the room in 3 strides, kneeling beside his sister's chair. "There's nothing to forgive, Beth. Just tell me how to help make things right." The next few hours passed in a blur of conversation and tears, laughter and remembering. Elizabeth's memories weren't perfect. There were still gaps and confused moments, but her love for her children shone through every word and gesture. She told them about the early years, when fear and paranoia had driven her to keep moving, always convinced someone was trying to take her children away. "I thought I was protecting them," she admitted, watching as Danny showed Dr. Chen his new winter coat. "But I was only teaching them to be afraid. When things started getting worse, when I couldn't trust my own memories anymore, I knew, so I had to get help. Riverside Haven was a miracle. Dr. Chen and her team, as they helped me understand what was happening in my mind." "And now?" Alexander asked gently. "What do you need now?" Elizabeth looked around the garden room, at her children playing nearby, at her brother sitting close enough to touch. "I need to get well, truly well for them." "But Alex," she hesitated, glancing at Dr. Chen. "The facility. They're struggling. Insurance only covers so much, and without additional funding—" "Don't worry about that," Alexander interrupted firmly. "I've already spoken with Dr. Chen about establishing a foundation to support the facility. Riverside Haven isn't going anywhere, and neither are you, not until you're ready." Fresh tears spilled down Elizabeth's cheeks. "You always did try to fix everything, big brother." "Not everything," he replied, thinking of his own losses, his years of isolation. "But this I can help with. And Beth, the kids can visit as often as you want. They'll stay with me at the manor, close enough to see you regularly while you focus on getting better." Sarah, who had been quietly listening nearby, stepped forward. "Really? We can stay with Uncle Alex and see you too?" Elizabeth pulled her daughter close. "If that's what you want, sweetheart, you and Danny deserve a stable home, and your uncle, well, I think maybe he needs you as much as you need him." Alexander felt Danny's small hand slip into his and looked down to find the boy smiling up at him. "Can we plant a jacaranda tree at the manor?" Danny asked. "Like the ones here?" "Of course we can," Alexander replied, his heart full to bursting. "In fact, I think we should plant a whole grove of them. Your mother always did love purple flowers." Outside the garden room windows, the winter sun was setting over the Hudson, painting the snow in shades of gold and rose. Inside, a family was beginning to heal, finding their way back to each other, one memory, one moment, one promise at a time. Chapter 8. Seeds of Change. The weeks following their first visit to Riverside Haven brought dramatic changes to life at Morrison Manor. Alexander threw himself into transforming the East Wing into a proper living space for the children, consulting, with Sarah and Danny on everything from paint colors to furniture. The library gained a dedicated children's corner, and the game room was restored to its former glory, with updated equipment and comfortable seating. But the most significant transformation was happening in the greenhouse and gardens. Alexander had commissioned a specialist in jacaranda trees, determined to create a piece of Riverside Haven at the manor. The greenhouse would nurture the saplings until spring, when they would be planted in a specially designed grove. "The soil composition needs to be just right," the botanist explained one morning, showing Sarah and Danny the preparations. "Jacarandas are particular about their environment, but once they take root, they're remarkably resilient. Like us," Sarah whispered to Danny, who nodded sagely. Alexander, overhearing the exchange, felt his heart swell. The children were blooming like the tree saplings, growing stronger and more confident with each passing day. Their twice-weekly visits to Elizabeth helped, each reunion bringing new progress and healing. One particularly cold morning, as Alexander reviewed the latest reports from Riverside Haven in his study, Wheeler arrived with unexpected news. "I've been following up on some loose ends," the investigator said, settling into a chair. "Specifically, about Elizabeth's paranoia during those early years. It turns out she wasn't entirely wrong about being watched." Alexander looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "There was someone following her, Marcus Reynolds, a private investigator hired by your father's former business partner, Victor Caldwell. Remember him?" Alexander's expression darkened. "How could I forget? He tried to take over the company after Dad passed, claimed there was some secret agreement giving him controlling interest." "Exactly," Wheeler nodded. "And when that failed, he apparently became obsessed with finding leverage against your family. He must have learned about Elizabeth's pregnancy and saw an opportunity." "To do what?" Alexander demanded, his protective instincts flaring. To force a new negotiation, perhaps? Using Elizabeth's vulnerable state and the existence of her children as pressure points? Wheeler shrugged. We may never know for sure. Caldwell suffered a stroke 2 years ago. He's in a care facility himself now, unable to communicate. Alexander sat back, processing this information. Does Elizabeth know? Dr. Chen thinks it's best to wait before sharing this. Elizabeth's recovery is progressing well. Learning that her paranoia had some basis in reality might be destabilizing right now. As if summoned by the conversation, Sarah appeared in the doorway. She had become comfortable enough to seek Alexander out in his study, especially when something was bothering her. Uncle Alex, she said hesitantly, Danny's not feeling well. Alexander immediately rose from his desk, parental instincts overriding all other concerns. What's wrong? His throat hurts and he feels hot. Sarah's hand went to her pendant, a gesture she still maintained, even though the original now hung around her mother's neck again. Alexander had commissioned a replica for Sarah, understanding her need for that tangible connection. Danny was indeed running a fever, and by evening it was clear he needed medical attention. As Alexander carried his nephew to the car, he couldn't help but remember the last time he'd made this drive to the hospital, the night he lost Catherine and Tommy. Sarah, perceptive as always, seemed to read his thoughts. It's just a sore throat, Uncle Alex. Danny will be okay. The emergency room was busy, but Danny's fever was high enough to warrant immediate attention. As they waited for test results, Sarah curled up in a chair beside her brother's bed while Alexander paced the room, memories threatening to overwhelm him. Mr. Morrison? A young doctor entered the room, smiling reassuringly. Good news. It's just strep throat. We'll start him on antibiotics, and he should be feeling better in a day or two. The relief was immediate and powerful. Alexander sank into a chair, thanking the doctor profusely. As she left, Danny stirred in his bed. Uncle Alex, he called, weakly. Can you tell me a story, like the ones you used to tell Tommy? Alexander's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't told stories since. But looking at Danny's fever-bright eyes and Sarah's hopeful face, he found himself nodding. Once upon a time, he began, his voice growing stronger with each word, there was a magical grove of purple trees. In this grove lived a family of birds, each with feathers of a different color. As he wove the tale, Alexander felt something healing in his own heart. The hospital room, once a place of devastating memories, was being transformed by the presence of these children who had brought such unexpected joy to his life. Later that night, with Danny sleeping peacefully under the influence of medicine, and Sarah finally dozing in her chair, Alexander stepped into the hallway to call Dr. Chen. Elizabeth would want to know about Danny's illness, even though it was minor. As he waited for the call to connect, Alexander watched through the room's window as Sarah instinctively reached for her brother's hand in her sleep. These children, who had experienced so much uncertainty in their young lives, still maintained such a powerful capacity for love and trust. The jacaranda saplings in his greenhouse weren't the only things putting down new roots and reaching for the sky. His entire family was growing, healing, transforming, like a garden awakening after a long winter. Chapter 9. Blooming Possibilities. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it new beginnings for the Morrison family. The jacaranda saplings were ready for planting, and the garden team had prepared a special area where the grove would flourish. But Alexander's plans extended far beyond the manor's grounds. In his office at Morrison Industries, he sat with a team of lawyers and financial advisors, finalizing the details of the Morrison Family Foundation. The organization would not only support Riverside Haven, but also establish a network of mental health facilities and children's programs across the Northeast. The initial endowment will be substantial, Alexander explained, reviewing the documents. We'll focus first on saving Riverside Haven, then expand to identify similar facilities in need of support. Sarah, who had asked to attend the meeting, sat quietly in a corner, absorbing everything with her characteristic intelligence. At just 8 years old, she had already shown a remarkable interest in understanding how she could help other children like herself and Danny. Uncle Alex, she spoke up during a break, Could we also help kids find their families like how we found you? Alexander smiled at his niece, constantly amazed by her compassion. That's an excellent idea, Sarah. We could establish a family reunification program as part of the Foundation's work. The Foundation's announcement attracted significant media attention. The Burlington Free Press ran a front-page story about the Morrison family's initiative, featuring a photo of Alexander with Sarah and Danny planting the first jacaranda tree in the new grove. Elizabeth's story was kept private, but the article highlighted the Foundation's mission to support mental health care and help vulnerable children. One morning, as Alexander prepared for another Foundation meeting, Mrs. Sullivan brought him a stack of letters from families touched by the initiative. One in particular caught his attention, a letter from a young mother who had been considering giving up her children due to mental health struggles, but found hope in the Foundation's program. "Sarah," he called out to his niece, who was reading in her favorite window seat nearby. "Would you like to help me with something important?" She marked her place in her book and came over to his desk. "What is it?" "These are letters from people who need our help," he explained. "I thought maybe you could help me understand what these families might need most. You have a unique perspective that could be valuable." Sarah's face lit up with purpose. She pulled a chair close to Alexander's desk and began reading the letters with him. Her insights were remarkable. She noticed details adults might miss, understanding instinctively what children in crisis needed most. As they worked, Danny burst into the study, excited about his latest art project from school. "Look what I made," he exclaimed, holding up a colorful drawing of their jacaranda grove, complete with purple blooms and a family standing beneath the trees. "It's beautiful, Danny," Alexander praised, noting how the boy had drawn all of them together. Himself, Sarah, Danny, Elizabeth, and even Mrs. Sullivan. The family's journey was captured perfectly in a child's artistic vision. Later that afternoon, during their regular video call with Elizabeth, they shared news about the Foundation's progress. Elizabeth's face glowed with pride as she listened to Sarah's ideas for helping other families. "You've always had such a big heart, Alex," Elizabeth said softly. "Now I see where Sarah gets it from. She gets it from both sides of the family," Alexander replied, watching as Sarah helped Danny show their mother his artwork through the screen. The call was interrupted by Dr. Chen, who had exciting news of her own. "Elizabeth's latest evaluations show remarkable improvement," she announced. "We're discussing the possibility of transitional visits to the manor, perhaps starting with supervised day trips." The children's faces lit up at this news, and Alexander felt his own heart soar. The possibility of having Elizabeth home, even for short visits, felt like another piece of their family puzzle falling into place. That evening, as the spring sunset painted the sky in shades of lavender that rivaled their jacaranda blooms, Alexander found Sarah and Danny in the grove. They were working on what appeared to be a sign. "What are you two up to?" he asked, approaching their project. "We're making a welcome sign for Mom's first visit," Danny explained proudly, showing off his careful lettering. Sarah added, "And we thought maybe we could put a little free library out here too, for other kids who come to the Foundation." Danny said reading stories helped him feel less scared when things were hard. Alexander felt his throat tighten with emotion. These children, who had experienced such uncertainty in their young lives, were already thinking of ways to help others. The Foundation wasn't just about providing financial support. It was about creating a legacy of compassion and understanding. "I think that's a wonderful idea," he said, sitting down to help them with their sign. "In fact, why don't we design a whole reading garden around the jacaranda grove? We could create a peaceful place where families can spend time together, just like we do." As they worked on their plans, the spring breeze carried the sweet scent of new blooms through the air. The jacaranda trees, though still young, were already beginning to flower, their purple blossoms a testament to the power of faith and careful nurturing. Just like these trees, Alexander thought, watching his niece and nephew work, every person needs the right conditions to thrive: love, support, understanding, and the chance to put down roots in fertile soil. The Morrison Family Foundation would help provide those conditions for as many families as possible, creating a network of support as strong and beautiful as their growing grove of jacaranda trees. Chapter 10. Hearts in Bloom. The day of Elizabeth's first visit to Morrison Manor dawned bright and clear. The jacaranda grove was in full bloom, creating a canopy of purple flowers that seemed to float like clouds above the reading garden Sarah and Danny had helped design. Benches and comfortable reading nooks were scattered throughout the space, each offering a different view of the colorful surroundings. Alexander stood in the kitchen with Mrs. Sullivan, watching her prepare Elizabeth's favorite meals, while Sarah and Danny decorated the dining room. The children had spent days planning every detail, determined to make their mother's first visit perfect. "The cookies smell just like Mom used to make them," Sarah commented, coming into the kitchen to check on the baking. Her hand went to her pendant, a gesture that now seemed more excited than anxious. "That's because it's her recipe," Mrs. Sullivan smiled, pulling another batch from the oven. "She and I used to bake these together when she was about your age." The sound of car tires on gravel brought everyone to attention. Danny ran to the window, his face lighting up. "They're here." Dr. Chen had accompanied Elizabeth for this first visit, though she would maintain a discreet distance to allow the family their privacy while ensuring Elizabeth's comfort. As Alexander opened the front door, he was struck by how different his sister looked from their first reunion at Riverside Haven. Elizabeth stood straighter now, her eyes clear and bright. She wore a simple sundress in a shade of purple that matched the jacaranda blooms, and around her neck hung the original family locket. But it was her smile, confident and warm, that showed how far she had come. "Welcome home, Beth," Alexander said softly, pulling his sister into a gentle hug. The children rushed forward next, Danny wrapping himself around his mother's waist, while Sarah approached more slowly, taking in every detail of the moment. Elizabeth knelt down, gathering both her children close. "My darlings," she whispered, touching her locket that matched Sarah's. "Look how you've made this place bloom." They gave Elizabeth a tour of the manor, showing her all the changes they'd made. She paused often to take in familiar sights, the family photos on the walls, the view from the library windows, the kitchen where she'd spent so many hours with Mrs. Sullivan. But it was the jacaranda grove that brought tears to her eyes. "Here's just like our special place at Riverside," Danny said proudly, leading her to the reading nook he'd helped design. "But better, because now other kids can enjoy it too." Elizabeth sat on one of the benches, looking up at the purple canopy above them. "I always loved jacaranda trees," she said softly. "Even during my darkest times when my mind was playing tricks on me, the sight of their flowers helped me remember who I was. They bloom against all odds, you see, even in places where people say they shouldn't grow." Sarah sat beside her, mother, while Danny climbed into her lap. Alexander stood nearby, watching his family together in the grove he'd created for them. "The foundation had its first success story yesterday," he told Elizabeth. "A mother and her children who reminded me so much of you and the kids. We were able to help her get the support she needed while keeping her family together." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "You've taken our story of pain and turned it into hope for others," she said, reaching for her brother's hand. "I used to think I had to protect the children from everything, including our family. But you've shown them, shown all of us, that family can be our greatest strength." "Uncle Alex says we're like the jacaranda trees," Danny piped up. "We just needed the right place to grow." "And the right people to help us grow," Sarah added wisely. As they sat together in the dappled sunshine filtering through the purple blooms, Alexander reflected on how much had changed since that Christmas Eve, when two lost children found their way to him. His home, once a museum of painful memories, had become a sanctuary of healing and hope. The Morrison Family Foundation was already touching lives, creating ripples of positive change throughout the community. Dr. Chen, who had been observing from a distance, approached with a smile. "Elizabeth," she said warmly, "seeing you here. With your family, I'm more confident than ever in our discussion about transitioning to outpatient care. Your progress has been remarkable." The news brought fresh joy to the family gathering. As they celebrated with Mrs. Sullivan's cookies and lemonade in the garden, Alexander watched his sister laughing with her children, her face radiant with happiness and health. The jacaranda trees swayed gently in the spring breeze, their purple, flowers creating shifting patterns of light and shadow on the ground below. Like these beautiful trees, his family had pushed through difficult soil, weathered storms, and emerged stronger. Their story, he realized, was still blooming, each day bringing new growth, new hope, new possibilities. Sarah caught his eye and smiled, her hand touching her pendant in what had become more of a celebration than a comfort gesture. In that moment, Alexander understood that while the past couldn't be changed, it could be transformed, like winter into spring, like fear into courage, like an empty house into a home filled with love. Chapter 11. Full Circle. 1 year had passed since that fateful Christmas Eve. Morrison Manor was buzzing with activity as preparations for a special event reached their final stages. The Jacaranda Grove, now matured into a stunning purple canopy, would serve as the backdrop for the Morrison Family Foundation's first annual gala. Elizabeth, who had successfully transitioned to outpatient care 6 months ago, stood in front of her old bedroom mirror, adjusting the elegant purple gown she'd chosen for the occasion. Sarah sat on the bed nearby, already dressed in a matching, smaller version, watching her mother with quiet joy. "You look beautiful, Mom," she said, touching her pendant, now a gesture of happiness rather than anxiety. Elizabeth smiled at her daughter's reflection, reaching up to touch her own matching locket. "Do you remember what you told me the day you gave this back to me?" Elizabeth asked, turning to face her daughter. "You said love finds its way home." "You were right, my clever girl. Look at us now." A knock at the door revealed Danny, dapper in his little suit with Alexander right behind him. "The first guests are arriving," Danny announced importantly. He had taken his role as junior host very seriously, memorizing the names of all the major donors and beneficiaries who would be attending. Alexander looked at his sister and niece, emotion plain on his face. "You both look perfect," he said softly. "Ready to share our story?" Elizabeth nodded, her eyes clear and confident. Tonight, she would give the keynote speech, sharing her journey from darkness to healing. It was a step she'd chosen to take, believing that her story could help others find hope. The Jacaranda Grove had been transformed for the evening. Twinkling lights were strung between the trees, creating a magical canopy above the gathered guests. The reading nooks had been temporarily converted into intimate seating areas, while the central space held rows of chairs facing a small stage. As the sun set and guests took their seats, Alexander stood at the podium to open the evening. Looking out at the crowd, he saw familiar faces: Dr. Chen and her staff from Riverside Haven, Wheeler sitting proudly with his family, Mrs. Sullivan beaming from the front row. But he also saw new faces, families who had been helped by the foundation, donors who had caught the vision, community leaders who had become partners in their mission. 1 year ago, he began, "My life changed forever when 2 brave children found their way to me on Christmas Eve. They taught me that family isn't just about blood or memories. It's about love, healing, and the courage to begin again." From her seat in the front row, Sarah caught his eye and smiled. Danny, sitting between his sister and mother, gave a tiny wave. Alexander felt his heart swell with love for these children who had brought such unexpected joy to his life. "The Morrison Family Foundation was born from their story," he continued. "In our first year, we've helped 20 families stay together while accessing mental health care. We've supported 3 facilities like Riverside Haven, preventing their closure and expanding their services. But perhaps most importantly, we've created a community where no one has to face their struggles alone." As he introduced Elizabeth, Alexander watched his sister rise and walk to the podium with grace and strength. Gone was the confusion and fear that had haunted her for so many years. In its place was a woman who had faced her demons and emerged, stronger, ready to help others do the same. Elizabeth's speech moved many in the audience to tears. She spoke of mental health struggles with honesty and hope, of the love that had given her the strength to seek help, of the children who had never lost faith in her. When she described how Sarah and Danny had carried her love with them in a silver locket, finding their way back to family and healing, there wasn't a dry eye under the jacaranda trees. But it was Sarah who provided the evening's most powerful moment. After her mother's speech, she asked to say a few words, Standing on a small step stool to reach the microphone, she looked out at the gathered crowd with remarkable poise. "When I was little," she began, "I thought my job was to protect everyone, my brother, my mom, our secrets. But Uncle Alex taught me that sometimes protecting people means letting others help them. Sometimes love means asking for help when you need it." Danny, not wanting to be left out, joined his sister at the podium. "And sometimes," he added with the simple wisdom of a 6-year-old, "family gets bigger instead of smaller, like our jacaranda." "Grove!" The audience laughed and applauded, touched by the children's sincerity. As Sarah and Danny returned to their seats, Elizabeth pulled them close, her eyes meeting Alexander's across the podium. In that moment, they shared an understanding of how far they had come, from broken pieces to a family made stronger by adversity. The evening continued with dinner and dancing under the illuminated trees. The foundation received numerous new pledges of support, ensuring its ability to help more families in the coming year. But for Alexander, the true success of the night was watching his family shine with health and happiness. Later, as the last guests departed and the lights in the grove twinkled like earthbound stars, Alexander found Sarah sitting in her favorite reading nook, looking thoughtful. "What's on your mind, sweetheart?" he asked, joining her on the cushioned bench. Sarah looked up at the purple flowers above them, now silvery in the moonlight. "I was thinking about next Christmas," she said, "about other children who might need to find their way home like we did." Alexander pulled her close, marveling at her compassionate heart. "Then we'll be ready to help them," he promised. That's what family does. Chapter 12. Love Blooms Eternal. The success of the Foundation's first gala sparked a wave of positive change across the region. As summer turned to fall and fall began wearing winter's colors, the Morrison family found themselves at the heart of a growing community of hope and healing. Elizabeth had fully moved back to the manor, her recovery a testament to the power of professional help and family support. She now worked part-time with the Foundation, her experience making her uniquely qualified to connect with families in crisis. The confusion and fear that had once clouded her mind had been replaced by clarity and purpose. One crisp December morning, as the first snow of the season dusted the dormant jacaranda grove, Sarah found Alexander in his study, working on plans for the Foundation's expansion. "Uncle Alex," she said, her expression serious, "I think I'm ready to tell you something about the night Danny and I found you." Alexander set aside his papers, giving his niece his full attention. At 9 years old now, Sarah carried herself with a quiet confidence that made her seem older than her years, though she had finally learned to be a child again too. "That night," she began, touching her pendant out of habit, "I wasn't just hoping to find help. I had seen your picture in the paper before, talking about the children's hospital wing, but what made me sure was something Mom had told me during one of her clear days at Riverside Haven." She pulled out a carefully folded paper from her pocket, the note that had been hidden in the original locket. She said to look for the man with kind eyes who built places to help children heal. She said you'd understand about healing places, because you had lost people too. Alexander felt tears prick his eyes as he remembered that Christmas Eve, how close he had come to driving home instead of walking through the plaza. "Your mother always could see right through me," he said softly. "She said the Morrison heart would guide us home," Sarah continued. "And it did. But Uncle Alex, I think it guided you home too." From the hallway came the sound of Danny's laughter mixed with Elizabeth's voice. They were decorating for Christmas, transforming the manor into a wonderland of lights and greenery. Mrs. Sullivan's cookies filled the house with familiar scents, and somewhere a Christmas carol played softly. "You know what, Sarah? I think you're right," Alexander smiled, standing and offering his hand to his niece. "Should we go help with the decorations?" The next few weeks passed in a blur of holiday preparations and foundation work. The Morrison Family Foundation had identified 3 more facilities in need of support, and Elizabeth's outreach program was helping dozens of families navigate mental health challenges while staying together. On Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year, after Sarah and Danny had entered his life, Alexander stood in the plaza where he had first found them. But this time he wasn't alone. His family surrounded him: Elizabeth, Sarah, Danny, Mrs. Sullivan, and even Dr. Chen had joined them for the Foundation's community celebration. The plaza had been transformed into a winter wonderland, with the Foundation hosting a gathering for families they had helped throughout the year. Children played in the snow, while parents chatted over hot chocolate, sharing stories of hope and recovery. Near the grand Christmas tree, a choir sang carols, their voices carrying on the crisp winter air. "Hard to believe it's been a year," Elizabeth said, standing beside her brother. She watched as Sarah and Danny helped younger children build snowmen, their faces glowing with joy. "Sometimes it feels like they've always been here," Alexander replied, "like the house was just waiting for them all along." Danny ran up to them, his cheeks red from cold and excitement. "Mom, Uncle Alex, come see what we made." They followed him to where Sarah stood proudly beside an elaborate snow sculpture. It wasn't just a snowman, it was a snow family, standing beneath what was clearly meant to be a jacaranda tree, complete with purple winter berries carefully arranged to simulate the tree's flowers. "It's us," Danny explained unnecessarily, beaming at his artistic creation. "Under our special trees." Elizabeth knelt beside her son, pulling him close. "It's perfect, sweetheart, just like our real family." As they stood together in the gently falling snow, Alexander reflected on how much had changed in 1 year. His home, once a mausoleum of memories, now rang with laughter and love. The Foundation was changing lives, creating ripples of hope that spread further with each passing day. And his heart, which he had thought forever broken, had not only healed but grown larger, making room for this unexpected, beautiful family. Sarah slipped her hand into his, looking up with those wise eyes that had first caught his attention 1 year ago. "Uncle Alex, thank you for helping us find our way home." "Thank you for helping me find mine," he replied softly. Above them, the Christmas lights twinkled like stars, and somewhere in the greenhouse at Morrison Manor, the first jacaranda buds of next spring were already forming, waiting to burst into bloom. Like their family, the trees would continue to grow, their roots deepening, their branches reaching ever upward toward the light. Love, Alexander had learned, was like those jacaranda trees. Given the right care and conditions, it could bloom in any season, transforming ordinary moments into extraordinary beauty. And as he stood surrounded by his family on this sacred anniversary, he knew that their story would continue to flower and grow, touching more lives with each passing year. The Morrison heart had indeed guided them all home, not to a place, but to each other. And in that discovery lay the greatest gift of all, the knowledge that love, once planted and properly tended, blooms eternal.